Hello and welcome to the 2020 Understanding Risk Forum. I'm Kaori Enjoji and I'm joining you from Tokyo. The video we have seen really does bring to life the incredible history of the Understanding Risk community and celebrates the excellent work and amazing people who have been part of this community over the last 10 years. In 2010, we were spurred by the Haiti earthquake to act. The founding members of UR recognized two things. Firstly, that to manage risk, we must first understand the risk that we are trying to manage. And secondly, that we can accomplish more if we talk to each other and form partnerships that are outside of our typical spheres. With this mission, this community has seen great growth and progress over the years. As well as being the 10th anniversary, today marks the 6th Global Forum and the first ever virtual forum where we are broadcasting in 3 time zones. We have over 100 sessions and plenaries for you to choose from over the next 3 days, so make sure you check out the agenda. We invite you to tag us on hashtag UR2020 and tell us how this community has contributed to your work using hashtag URStory. I'm delighted to be part of today's celebration and to know how many of us are able to get together virtually to enjoy this exciting event. It is really interesting to reflect on the advancements made over the past decade and celebrate special moments, as well as look forward to what lies ahead of us. This field and the move towards resilience has come a long way over the last 10 years, and yet we see many types of challenges continuing to come our way. We are all very aware of the issues we face, with climate change and the impact of COVID-19, amongst others, and the opportunities with new technologies and creative approaches that propel us into the next 10 years. These 3 days should be a great place for you to learn and connect to new ideas. I will be your guide as we reflect on the work accomplished and develop new perspectives on the future. This, of course, could not have been possible without the support of our partners. We are grateful for the financial partnership from the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the World Bank, Google, Esri, and FM Global, and to all of you who have contributed your time and energy to create amazing content, thank you so much. Before I proceed, we would like to invite you to send in a picture of yourself so that we can include you in the highlights video for the closing ceremony. And don't forget that most content will be recorded and will be available for you to watch after the forum. Now, I invite you to join me as we move forward together through an exciting opening ceremony. First off, I would like to present World Bank Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships, Mari Pangestu.
Hello, selamat datang, and a warm welcome to the Understanding Risk community. My name is Mari Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnership at the World Bank. I am very pleased to open the 2020 Understanding Risk Forum. We all know that 2020 has been a devastating year. COVID-19 has impacted lives and livelihoods, affecting the poorest the hardest. Globally, the health and economic ramifications have been unprecedented. At the same time, natural disasters and risks have not gone away during the pandemic. If anything, COVID-19 has emphasized why we must continue to invest in understanding multiple risks, building preparedness, and preventing the creation of new risks. Governments and communities need to be prepared to address multiple shocks, as we saw during hurricane evacuations across Central America last month, or in recovery efforts from the Zagreb earthquake earlier this year. This is also an important moment to take stock as a community, given that this is the 10th year of the Understanding Risk Forum. In the past decade, this community has grown from a few hundred to over 10,000 members, where we have disaster risk management experts and practitioners from the public, academic, scientific, tech, and NGOs communities, coming together, representing 180 countries and more than 2,000 organizations. Every time this forum is convened, it brings to the fore a new wave of innovation in this field. To build on the theme of this year's forum and having looked back, let's ask ourselves, what should come next and what should we look forward to? First is about strong foundations, understanding, communicating, and raising awareness of disaster risk is the fundamental basis for good disaster risk management. Second, it is about solutions that work in the real world, affordable, effective, and accessible approaches and tools to assess and communicate risks, particularly for the poorest and most vulnerable. And third, it is about the value of partnerships. If we are to succeed, we will need more cooperation and more evidence-based policymaking. And I believe that is why you are all here today. The next 3 days promise to be very thought-provoking, covering topics from COVID-19 to social exclusion and deep technology and artificial intelligence. As you tune in, I urge you to enjoy the virtual interactions, be challenged to think innovatively, and help shape and build our common understanding of risks so we can be better prepared and act together to build a more resilient world. Thank you and have a productive discussion.
And that was Mari Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank. Thank you so much for that welcome. And now we have for you a speech from Peter Ho, former head of the Singapore Civil Service and currently Senior Advisor, Singapore Center for Strategic Futures. His speech explores understanding risk, memory, imagination, and metaphor.
Hello. I would like to thank the organizers, namely the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery of the World Bank, and the Lloyd's Register Foundation Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk at the National University of Singapore for inviting me to speak at this Understanding Risk 2020 conference. The COVID-19 pandemic belongs to a category of risk that is called dread risk. Professor Gerd Gigerenzer, a German psychologist who studies risk, describes dread risk as a low probability, high damage event. Dread risk is often used in reference to natural hazards and threats to the environment or to health, such as nuclear power. The Fukushima nuclear disaster demonstrates aspects of dread risk. The huge Tohoku earthquake in Japan generated a massive tsunami that breached the defenses of the Fukushima nuclear power plant, leading to meltdowns that leaked radiation into the atmosphere. Although the earthquake and tsunami combined killed about 16,000 people, the Fukushima nuclear disaster itself produced no direct fatalities. Instead, about 600 people died as a result of evacuation procedures and stress-induced factors. But Fukushima was perceived to have the dread potential to kill a lot of people. It was this accident, rather than the earthquake, that captured the imagination and dominated news around the world for weeks, creating widespread anxiety. For example, news that potassium iodide pills could help prevent radiation-induced thyroid cancer sparked a run on pharmacy supplies in the United States, thousands of miles away from the disaster. More significantly, the incident led to Germany forswearing the use of nuclear power. Even though dread risks like the Fukushima nuclear disaster might actually cause fewer deaths than other risks that we happily live with, such as obesity, heart disease, or even driving and crossing the road, they capture the attention of the media, stoke anxiety, and make people excessively fearful. That fear can change our behavior in ways that actually increase our risk of injury or death. For example, people are now avoiding visits to hospitals because they fear catching COVID-19. According to a survey of the World Stroke Organization of 100 countries, hospital admissions for stroke symptoms dropped by an average of 60% in the first months of the pandemic compared to the same period in 2019. What makes dread risks different from other risks? A key difference is the perception that a dread risk can cause many people to die at the same time. When threats are new and dramatic, such as the 9/11 attacks with their visceral images of passenger jets crashing into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., they create a strong emotional impact that skews our perception of how dangerous they are. People will also misjudge the likelihood of that catastrophe recurring. This is the availability heuristic, the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events with greater availability in memory, which can be influenced by how recent the memories are or how unusual or emotionally charged they may be. So after a shocking event like 9/11, we will think that another terrorist attack is a more probable risk than something else, simply because it is fresh in our minds. In an oft-cited study, Professor Gigerenzer found that in the months after 9/11, more people chose to drive rather than to fly, feeling it was safer. Passenger miles on the main US airlines plunged between 12 to 20% over a 3-month period, while road use jumped. The change is widely believed to have been caused by worried people opting to drive rather than to fly. But the reality is that traveling long distances by car is actually more dangerous than traveling the same distance by aeroplane. Gigerenzer estimated that an extra 1,500 Americans died in car accidents in the year after the 9/11 attacks, indirect victims of the tragedy. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been deluged by alarming reports in the media. For the layman, it is hard to make sense of the risk that COVID-19 poses. This is in comparison to single events like plane crashes and natural disasters, for which we have learned to weigh the risk and even become inured to them. Professor David Spiegelhalter, the well-known British statistician, suggests that to meaningfully understand the risk of COVID-19, we should compare it to the risk of dying the next year, which is our annual death risk. Catching COVID-19 doubles your annual death risk, which is very low if you are young. But because our annual death risk rises exponentially from the age of 10, the COVID-19 risk factor increases significantly the older you are. Furthermore, even if the personal risk is low, you may spread the infection to more other vulnerable people. And that is why we need to look beyond individual risk, which actually can be low if you are young. Instead, we should think about the collective risks, which are high. And this is because infectious diseases like COVID-19 spread and multiply in ways that other individual risks, like those of car crashes or heart attacks, do not. That pandemics pose huge collective risks ought to surprise no one. Throughout history, humanity has confronted pandemics with devastating consequences. The Black Death in the 14th century is thought to have killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Scaled up as a percentage of the world population today, that would reach nearly 4 billion deaths. The Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920 infected 500 million people and killed perhaps a tenth of them. Between 1 to 4 million people died as a result of the Hong Kong flu epidemic that lasted between 1968 and 1969. A novel outbreak like SARS in 2003 can subside fairly quickly, but others like COVID-19 would rapidly get out of hand and turn into a real existential threat. Although our response to such dread risks might seem like an overreaction on an individual level, it can make sense from the perspective of survival of a city, a country, and even the human species. It is not unreasonable to speculate that dread risk may be an evolutionary impulse. Early man lived in small hunter-gatherer tribes. The simultaneous death of a large number of members in a tribe would have threatened its very existence. So actions that entailed that risk, however small, were especially dreaded and to be avoided. All risk, and not just dread risk, is very much a psychological construct. It is the subjective judgment that people and even whole societies make about the characteristics and severity of a risk. However, most people are more concerned with problems which appear to impact daily life rather than long-term problems that may affect future generations, such as climate change. In his book Collapse, the American polymath Jared Diamond explains the process by which a major change can be accepted as normal and acceptable if it happens slowly through small, often unnoticeable changes, not unlike the proverbial frog in boiling water. Diamond calls this creeping normality. Most people have no direct experience of climate change or do not notice its impact because the changes appear imperceptible and occur over a long period. As a result, they adopt a wait-and-see attitude, unwilling to change environmentally destructive behaviors, even when experts provide detailed and clear risks caused by climate change. Risk is also a social construct. Perceptions of risk are not just held by individuals. They are also constructed by society through its institutions, cultural values, and experience. The tighter the binding of society, the more individuals are connected by feelings of belonging or solidarity. And this includes attitudes to risk. The basic idea that collectivism, putting the common good ahead of individual freedoms, may make people more conscientious about avoiding behaviors that could cause dread risk. And this is one reason why countries in Asia, where collectivism has deeper roots, or New Zealand, where community ethos is strong, have seen greater success in tackling COVID-19. In contrast, the emphasis on human rights and freedoms have seen people in many Western countries push back when their governments require them to wear masks or stay at home. Not surprisingly, the spirit of collectivism and the social bonds that exist within small tribes are much stronger than those among residents in larger societies. In 2004, I had the privilege of visiting Port Blair, the capital of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, an island chain in the Indian Ocean with unique flora and fauna. And within that ecosystem is North Sentinel Island. I learned that it is a tiny island occupied by a small Stone Age tribe that is supposed to indulge in cannibalism. The authorities, for good reason, steer clear of the island. Not long after my visit, the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami washed through the Andamans and swept over North Sentinel Island. An Indian friend told me that some days later, the military flew a helicopter over the island without landing, perhaps a prudent precaution against a close encounter with a hungry tribe, and discovered to their surprise that the tribe had survived the catastrophe that had killed 2,000 in the Andamans. It turns out they were not alone. Another tribe on Little Andaman also fled to higher ground before the tsunami struck. These small tribes appear to have retained a collective memory from their ancestors of natural disasters and developed an ability to read the warning signs of an impending tsunami, perhaps the waters turning a different color or the birds and animals getting disturbed, and then to flee to the high point at the center of the island. The knowledge of these warning signs seems to be incorporated into an oral tradition. Importantly, the tribal system provided the social structure to transmit these oral traditions from generation to generation. In today's modern world, many of these traditions have either been abandoned or ignored, dismissed as either irrelevant or archaic. But they developed for a reason, to avoid dread risk, and endured for so long in memory because they serve an existential purpose of survival. Such traditions are therefore time-tested heuristics that rely on deeply embedded social memory in order to survive in a sometimes dangerous and uncertain world. The importance of memory in managing risk is illustrated once again in the Fukushima nuclear disaster. In seismically active Japan, earthquakes are a very real and significant risk to nuclear power plants. In 2007, an offshore earthquake caused a fire to break out at the world's largest nuclear power plant, Kashiwazaki Kariwa. With this recent event fresh in mind, Japan's Nuclear Industrial Safety Agency, or NISA, met to discuss the safety needs of each of the country's 70 nuclear power plants. In reviewing the safety guidelines for Fukushima, the panel used data from the largest earthquake recorded in the area, one that dated back to 1938. That earthquake had caused a small tsunami. As Fukushima is near the sea, it was decided to build a seawall high enough to stop a tsunami from flooding the reactor complex, and the height of the seawall was determined by the tsunami of 1938. Nevertheless, a seismologist at the NISA meeting felt that the 1938 earthquake tsunami was inadequate to serve as a basis for the Fukushima guidelines. He pointed out that there had been a much larger earthquake in the region, but it had occurred more than 1,000 years earlier in 869. The tsunami it generated led to extensive flooding of the Sendai Plain. But obviously, because it happened so long ago, the data for the earthquake depended more on archaeological evidence than on the precise information available for the 2007 earthquake. In a strong manifestation of the availability heuristic, the NISA panel decided that the 869 earthquake and tsunami were simply too historical and therefore would not be incorporated into the model for updating the Fukushima safety guidelines. This decision to focus on a short time horizon proved to be a costly mistake. In 2011, the tsunami unleashed by the Tohoku earthquake inundated an area that corresponded very closely to the 869 tsunami. We often think of earthquakes in spatial terms, how far we are from fault lines or from the ring of fire, or the proximity of our homes to the sea in areas vulnerable to tsunamis. But earthquakes and tsunamis also present us with temporal challenges. Ancient earthquakes and tsunamis are hidden from us because we do not look far enough backwards into the past. Ignoring the occurrence of an earthquake that occurred more than 1,000 years ago does not reflect a lack of memory. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, but we are a young species. Catherine Schultz of The New Yorker elegantly explained that the brevity of our lives breeds a kind of temporal parochialism, an ignorance of or an indifference to those planetary gears which turn more slowly than our own. In contrast, the tribes of North Sentinel Island and Little Andaman preserved ancestral memory of catastrophe, reflecting a collective determination to avoid dread risk. Collectively and across generations, they were able to overcome the temporal parochialism and survive the Boxing Day tsunami. This is actually not a problem of information. We also have a lot of archaeological evidence of when and where ancient earthquakes occurred. Catherine Schultz also wrote that we excel at imagining future scenarios, including awful ones. But such apocalyptic visions are a form of escapism, not a moral summons, and still less a plan of action. Where we stumble is in conjuring up grim futures in a way that helps us to avoid them. Indeed, many such grim futures or dread risks, natural disasters, pandemics, climate change, can often be assigned probabilities. This ought to lead authorities to take precautionary measures, but often they do not. The author, Margaret Heffernan, calls this willful blindness. The reasons why they do not are several. In the first place, leaders often have a hard time properly discounting the present value of events that will take place in the future. This tendency to place less emphasis on future risks and contingencies, and instead to place more weight on present costs and benefits, is a common cognitive bias known among behavioral economists as hyperbolic discounting. Many, if not all, governments indulge in it. One example of hyperbolic discounting at work is climate change. Governments understand the theoretical need to consider effects of global warming on future generations, but instead of spending time worrying about a problem that will, hopefully, occur only after they leave office, they tend to place greater emphasis on the current costs of mitigation and adaptation. The reasons why are deeply embedded in our human nature, and this leads me to the black elephant. What is the black elephant? The black elephant is a cross between a black swan and the elephant in the room. The black elephant is a risk that is actually visible to everyone, the proverbial elephant in the room. But no one wants to deal with it, so they pretend it is not there. When the risk actually happens, we all feign surprise and shock, behaving as if it were a black swan. The Thai floods of 2011 were an example of a black elephant. Everybody knows that floods occur frequently during the wet season along the low-lying Chao Phraya river system. But few paid much attention to the full downside potential of the flood risk in Thailand. Before 2011, it would have taken a big leap of imagination to connect flooding in Thailand to potential major disruptions of global supply chains. Perhaps floods occurred with such regularity that everyone was inured to them. So a little more rain than the historical maximum in the northern region, compounded by man-made factors such as deforestation, led to the massive floods of 2011. As a result, major industrial parks located outside Bangkok were covered by flood waters for weeks. Production ground to a halt and global supply chains were disrupted. The World Bank estimated the economic cost of the Thai floods at $46 billion. Ironically, for Japan's big three property casualty insurers, the Thai floods actually proved more costly than the Tohoku earthquake that same year. Much of our reluctance to grapple with such risks stems from an unwillingness to face the consequences of an uncertain and unpredictable future. These consequences interfere with long-held mental models and business or self-interest, creating cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance leads to many organizations, including government, to underestimate risks, ignoring warning signs of impending crisis, and taking decisive action only when the crisis unfolds. And this is the mother lode of black elephants. How can we limit or counter the influence of such bias? Obviously, the occurrence of a crisis that radically alters our mental models is one corrective. The SARS crisis of 2003 forced the Singapore government, as well as governments in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Vietnam, to take more deliberate steps to prepare for future pandemics. SARS corrected our biases, making us realize that the risks and costs of a pandemic were not trivial, and increased our alertness to the onset of another pandemic. Without SARS, it is difficult to imagine that our subsequent responses to the COVID-19 outbreak would have been as aggressive and as proactive as they have been, and contrast these responses with the initial lack of urgency in other countries which were largely unaffected by SARS. Identification, management, and communication of risk must take into account this human tendency to underestimate or overestimate risk. Memories of unpleasant or even catastrophic events drives our attitude to risks. This is a natural defensive mechanism, but memory is not perfect and is often impaired by our cognitive biases and by limits to our time horizons. While imagination can drive us to construct fanciful risks, our cognitive limitations, such as creeping normality, prevent us from translating these into proper risk assessment and then converting them into appropriate contingency plans. To understand and manage risks goes well beyond identifying what they are. It also depends on an awareness of the importance as well as limits of memory and imagination, and other psychological and social factors that shape attitudes to risk. Thank you.
Fascinating to hear about how a global thinker understands and explores the world. And now we are pleased to bring you two really excellent keynote presentations for you to choose from. Both are 15 minutes, and you can choose which keynote you would like to watch by clicking on the appropriate session name that you can see via your agenda. Both keynotes will be available for you to watch on demand after our forum, so don't worry if you find it a difficult choice. The options are Ken Pimblott, Chief of CAL FIRE. He's retired now, but devoted many years to firefighting and working his way through the ranks to director. Chief Pimblott's leadership saw CAL FIRE and the state of California battle historic wildfires and an unprecedented bark beetle epidemic, while at the same time increasing the pace and scale of forest management and fire prevention. Hear about his frontline experiences in this keynote. Your other option is Dr. Losang Rabge, co-founder and executive director at Mashik. Born in the Tibetan refugee settlement in India and raised in Canada, Dr. Rabge co-founded Mashik, a nonprofit whose mission is to grow a global community of care for a stronger future for Tibet. You will hear her experiences in taking risks through empathy and her commitment to community development to see long-term resiliency in Tibet. So please make your choice now by selecting which keynote you would like to watch, and I will see you in a bit.